Why is your mortgage rate higher for an investment property than it is for your own home? And what actually gets your investment property loan approved? That and more today with Ridge Lending Group President Caeli Ridge. When we talk about investor loans versus owner occupied loans, that really begs the question now, when does it make sense to house hack versus go straight into investor loans? What are some of the trade offs there?
I would argue that if you are in a position and you're willing to share your primary residence with, tenants, house hack is always a great idea because you've got these great loan terms, you've got this massive leverage, and almost always you've got other people making the entire mortgage payment for you or the vast majority of that mortgage payment. I'm such a big fan of that as a strategy for real estate investing. You've got to do it right, you got to do it by the rules, but I can't think of a downside if you qualify and you're willing to do that, to live with other people right next door, et cetera, et cetera. Some families don't think that works for them, whatever. I just think it's a fantastic way to jumpstart someone's real estate investment journey and then continue it. If you do it right every 12 months, then you'll be able to continue to parlay into the next, the next, the next. One thing I would say about that I don't get a lot of opportunity to talk about, but since we're talking about it here, if you're going to house hack and you've got a duplex, triplex, fourplex, and you want to manage it yourself, which I think everybody should be responsible to manage at least one rental property in their lifetime.
It's
Maybe
beneficial,
they
yeah.
do that. Yeah. More often than not, people will tend to pay for that service down the road, but having the experience is valuable. Do not tell the other tenants that you are the homeowner. Do yourself a favor and you're another tenant, but you don't want to let them know that you actually own the property. There's lots of emotional and different things that you want to avoid giving that information away to the tenants.
I have had two friends, and each friend owned a fourplex. And what they did is they would manage the other person's
Mm,
fourplex. That way, they were able to keep it more professional
smart.
and less emotional since it wasn't the owner directly dealing with the tenant. And that provided a buffer that really benefited them. Now, I haven't done that myself, but I found that such an interesting way to approach it.
Yeah, that's smart. If that ends up being your situation, definitely horse trade that way. Otherwise, you're just a tenant and you can be on call, whatever. Just avoid giving that information back to the other tenants that may be there.
What really gets a loan approved with some of those things like income and reserves and DTI?
This can be so confusing for the consumer because there are so many different vehicles in which to get mortgage funding. And there's something in our industry called an overlay. Okay. An overlay is taking the purest form of a guideline and adding layers of risk to it. I'll give you an example. Let's say that we know, or most of us know, that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac allow for up to 10 financed properties per qualified individual, right? That is a straight Fannie Freddie guideline. B of A, and this could be wrong, but a big boy bank may have an overlay and layers of risk that say we will only allow up to 4. Right. So all of this differing information, conflicting information, when the nice thing with Ridge is that we go by the purest form of the guideline. We are not going to impose those overlays. So in working with us, you're always going to be sure that we know exactly what those guidelines are. We know them like our own faces, and that we're not going to impose some additional risk layering or overlay that might prohibit or preclude the qualification. It's pretty basic stuff. I mean, if you're going full doc, Fannie, Freddie, and this can apply to our owner occupied and of course all of our non-owner occupied income, debt to income, credit, and assets. It's a pretty basic formula that we use. And then we've got all the other products that we have. Again, knowing those underwriting guidelines like the back of our hand is very important to making sure that we can navigate the battleship in a creek. That's the analogy that I give that tends to be mortgage lending, or what feels like mortgage lending anyway. So it's pretty basic. We have to understand what the borrower's qualifications are out of the gate, and then we can provide them with a schematic of options that they can tell us which direction they want to go in.
For quite a long time now, one could get 10 conventional investor loans single or 20 married. It wasn't always that way. I remember attending a real estate workshop in 2012, and you could only get 4 loans, or at least you could only easily get 4 investor loans. Before that expanded to 10. And we just shouldn't always assume that it's going to be this way forever.
Yeah, so I kind of going back before 0809, there was no limit to the number of finance properties Fannie and Freddie would secure per individual. After that crash, it shut off and it got to 4, to your point. And then it stayed there for a while until we kind of brought it back to that 10. There's been rumors for years that they're going to up it to 12 or 15 or some random number. I don't even know where it's coming from. I always make a joke and say, yeah, between now and my death, we'll see that. But it would be nice. It would be nice if they increased that number a few.
Now, as someone is qualifying there, you probably run into a lot of borrowers that believe certain myths or have to have misconceptions corrected. Tell us about some of those.
The biggest myths, I'm going to say that it's probably one of three things. They believe that they've got to make tens of thousands of dollars a month or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to qualify. Absolutely not true. It's so much less about the monthly income than it is the monthly income in relation to your minimum payments on your credit report. So just as an example, I could have a client that only shows $1,000 a month of income, but if they truly have no debt, and some of the other qualifying criteria, they can qualify for a mortgage on an investment property because the investment property has income to offset that mortgage payment. So it dispelled the myth about having massive amounts of monthly income. That's not necessary. It's about the income and your monthly debt that we find on your credit report. That would be the first thing. The other thing, speaking of credit reports, I would say is that a lot of times people think that the overall debt that they're carrying matters. I mean, Mr. Jones could have $300,000 worth of debt, but his monthly payments are only $1,500. All I care about is that monthly amount. I do not care what the total outstanding debt is. I hear that one a lot. Inquiries, credit inquiries. Every time you have your credit pulled, it drops the score 20 points. Not the case. Now, I can go down that rabbit hole, Keith, but it is a rabbit hole, so maybe I'll just leave it there. Your credit score does not drop X number every time you have your credit pulled. That's a misnomer.
Well, actually, that brings up a thought then. Once a prospective borrower initiates with you in there and gets the ball rolling in qualifying for a loan, what are some reasons that deals die late in the process? So, what does it take to be sure to hold that together?
I think it all boils down to communication. And we tell our clients this on the front end, treat us like your attorney. You tell us everything. Do not
Yeah.
omit anything so that we can ensure that we're guiding you appropriately. So lack of information can derail things. Let's say, for example, they change jobs and it's a completely new line of work, and it could prohibit or preclude the amount of income that we were using. Now DTI gets changed, or they buy a new car in the middle and they don't think it's going to come up, and now it's a DTI issue. It could be all kinds of things, but the point there is communication is key. Just keep us informed, and then we will give you the input or advice, and then you do what you want with that. But at least it's not once the bell is rung.
Live pretty conservatively and safely until that loan closes.
Yes, sir.
Well, does that bring up any stories? Sometimes people learn better that way. Is there a deal perhaps that should have worked, but it didn't?
That's a good question. I think that the answer is no, and mostly because we have such a diverse menu of loan products. Even if something did happen, and even if it was outside of anyone's control, let's say, we would normally just pivot to another loan product that would accommodate whatever that event ended up being. I cannot think of an example where a deal fell apart that could have gone differently, that we weren't able to just simply pivot into another path and close the loan for.
Well, America is a place that promotes entrepreneurship, and it seems like side hustles as well are more popular than they've been before. So, can you talk to us about how self-employed borrowers get evaluated?
Yeah, it is different. Self-employed, we're going to take, the simplest way to describe it is we're going to take the adjusted gross income, but there are something called add backs. So depending on what their deductions are, there are certain things like depreciation or amortization, or there's a whole slew of things that we're able to take those numbers and add it back into the adjusted gross and then divide by 12 or 24, whatever it needs to be. That's typically what we're going to be looking at for a self-employed person, versus the straight W-2 is just the gross income divided by 12 months.
A lot of people just don't understand the differences as to why investor loans cost more. Tell us about that.
Yeah, good question. It happens to be about secondary markets. So I won't get too technical, but when we talk about mortgage-backed securities, right, Wall Street, and this is an asset class that is bought and sold and traded, et cetera, there are demands, obviously, and then you've got layers of risk. So the baseline thinking is that an owner occupant is less likely to default on the home that they live in than
Right.
if something is going on financially with them, they've got some hardships, et cetera, they're going to cut loose the rental property before they're going to default on their primary. So that's just kind of the overall basic. There's other variables in there, but that's the one that makes the biggest difference is default rates on an owner occupied versus a non-owner occupied. And I want to give you guys an idea of the qualification markers between an owner occupied, let's just use an FHA, and a non-owner occupied purchase. So you can have 580 credit and put 3.5% down and have slightly over a 50% debt to income ratio and get an FHA loan, a GSE, government sponsored enterprise loan. All right. A non-owner occupied, you've got to walk on water, man. I make that dumb
Right.
joke, files of blood and DNA samples. You've got 25% down minimum. You've got to have X higher in credit score, all these extra reserves, et cetera, et cetera. So I would argue that secondary mentality thinking, the non-owner occupied is, in my opinion, probably a more stable loan as it relates to default. So there's some disconnect, I think, that the way that that is thought about in secondary market speak, but maybe a little TMI for the listeners. In any case, that's the reason that they're looked at differently. The ideal or the idea is that the owner occupied is less likely to default than the non-owner occupied. I would disagree with that premise.
And I think you would agree that things are still pretty tight because lending requirements are still pretty rigid, still pretty strict. You have to have a good credit history and assets and income, unlike what we had to have 20 years ago when I was a real estate investor myself, back when things were irresponsible. And back when things were free flowing and money was flying and a lot of nefarious things were happening, even though I had a good credit score all my life, I was the beneficiary of those high flying Wild West times myself. I remember on the first fourplex I owned after I had moved out of it, so I didn't even occupy it anymore, I got a generous appraisal for a 90% combined loan to value cash out refinance, 90% that I would not get today.
No way. Yeah. But that knee jerk is I think also part of the problem. They go the opposite way. That pendulum shift is I feel like there needs to be a little bit more reasonability in the mix and different markers to justify who should be getting or being able to take advantage.
All right. Well, this really brought up a lot of interesting things and some strategies, including house hacking, what you can do to go from 2 properties to 10 properties, and so on. But really, among all these strategies, is there one underrated strategy or one underutilized one that more people really ought to know about to either start or grow their portfolio, Caeli?
I would say that this is kind of a multi-prong. The all-in-one is probably as a strategy
The
and
all in
a
one loan.
tool.
Yeah, we discussed that last year, the all-in-one loan, and we sure don't have time to go into it all, but can you just give us a quick 1 minute on the all-in-one loan and why that can substantially save the amount of interest that one pays on their loan over time?
Okay, so 1 minute or less. Think about your 30-year fixed amortized mortgage. The reason that the payment is so low is because it's stretched over 30 years. However, you're going to pay a tremendous amount of interest if you were to make 360 payments later. The all-in-one is such a unique concept, mostly foreign in this country. It marries banking and a HELOC. Those two features, mortgage in the form of a HELOC and banking, and combines those two. And because interest accrual on any HELOC happens every single day based on the loan balance and an interest rate, because it's attached to your checking, your banking, checking savings, you are now in control what that daily balance is. The lower the balance, the lower the interest, and the more flexibility. I don't know that that was the best summation, but that's the nutshell.
Chili has an all-in-one loan calculator on her website where you can
Thank you.
enter your information and you can find out how great your interest savings over time would be, if anything, and they sure can walk you through that. Chili, this has been really good with some strategies and some actionable tactics. Before I ask how one can learn more about Ridge, is there any last thing that you'd like to share with us, whether that's to expand on anything we discussed or any of the more nascent things that have happened, like banks holding less in capital reserves or Fannie Mae accepting crypto backed mortgages? Is there anything else we really ought to know?
I think my advice right now for anybody that is in real estate investing, thinking about getting into real estate investing, be informed, listen to people like Keith. Ideally, listen to people like me. I've been doing this for a very, very long time. I'm an educator at heart. Get your information from sources that you can trust and try to avoid the analysis paralysis the best you can. I know that people get hung up on that, but now is the best time ever. And I would say that tomorrow and the next day and next year and the year after that to invest in real estate.
Yes, the only thing that could possibly make now better than ever is now is sooner than it's ever going to be again. Well, Caeli, if someone wants to get a hold of Ridge so they can tell you their situation and you can then help them find out how you can best help, what should they do?
There's so many ways. Check out our website, ridgelendinggroup.com. You can email us, info@ridgelendinggroup.com. You can call us toll free at 855-74-RIDGE. All of those ways get to us, and I look forward to speaking with each and every one of you.
You can watch this one next.